back to AG Paintball. I'm Matt. Today we're going to talk about how to time your autococker, which I assume you already own. If you tuned in, hoping that I can give you a 2-minute lesson on how to turn a specific knob 3 times to the left, maybe tighten this with an Allen wrench, 1.5 rotations, and that you'll be all set, unfortunately that's not going to happen. So autocockers are a fairly mechanically complex gun, and to have a chance at learning how to time them, you have to understand what each component does and how they interact with each other. And until you understand that, you really can't time an autococker. So that's what we're going to work on today. Let's go. So, at time of recording, it is early 2022, which makes me ask the question, what are you doing with an autococker? It's 2022. So let's talk about the history of autocockers and the level of interest the public has had in them over the last 30-odd years. So, it's 1989, and after we spent the decade of the 80s shooting pump guns, single-shot, 12-gram fed, 10-round tube type pump guns, along comes Bud Orr. And in 1989, he invents, right about here, the autococker, which goes on to be one of the most popular guns of the 1990s. Well, it's the early 1990s, and the autococker, along with the automag, is absolutely dominating the tournament scene and is also popular among the rec scene. Popularity continues to rise. More and more aftermarket parts become available, and even some custom gun houses start pumping out their own special edition models. Then, in 1996, something interesting happened. The introduction of the first electro-pneumatic to hit the market in the Smart Parts New Venture Shocker, followed shortly thereafter by the WDP Angel. Both the first electronically trigger-pulled guns on the market and the autococker begins to suffer a decline in popularity amongst both casual and tournament players. But wait, there's hope. In the early 2000s, a company you know as Planet Eclipse introduces the E-Blade, an electronic conversion for your existing autococker. This staves off defeat for a little while. It pumps new life into the platform. You see tournament players go back to using them or upgrading from mechanical to electro-pneumatic, and it looks like we are back in business. But we are not back in business. Paintball guns like the Intimidator, Shocker SFT, Impulse, Angel, all continue to make advances in electro-pneumatics, and eventually the E-Blade just can't keep up. We enter what I like to call the dark ages of autococker owners. From the mid-2000s into the teens, only the diehards are left keeping the flame alive. Autococker production generally slows or stops. Your custom autococker houses, for the most part, cease production of making high-end custom autocockers. A visit to eBay would allow someone to find autocockers selling for pennies on the dollar compared to where they were and where they are back to. Then, a strange thing happened. In the mid-teens, the old fat guys of the sport, of which there are many, came out of hiding and said, hey, I miss playing with my old autococker or automag, and mech tournaments are born. So we saw an increasing rise in autocockers once again, as they reached into their closet, dusted them off, and found that they didn't work. But once they got them back up and running, we had a growing and healthy mechanical tournament scene back in the woods. Now, here we are in 2022. Mechanical tournaments are as popular as ever. Players are back in the woods and on hyperball fields, banging away at each other. However, manufacturers have gotten into the mechanical space. So, super mechanical guns, as I like to call them, like the CS2, the Shocker Amp, TM40, means that autocockers are once again receding in terms of their popularity. Even at mechanical tournaments. They simply don't have the same rate of fire, accuracy, lightweight, air efficiency, reliability as these new super mechs do. So we're seeing a somewhat of a decline in the popularity of autocockers once again. All hope is not lost, though, for autococker enthusiasts. With the forthcoming expected pan-Asiatic lithium battery wars of the late 20s, we can expect to see an entire global disruption of the battery supply, forcing all paintball players to return to mechanical paintball guns. And if you happen to be watching this video in, say, 2030, we at AG would just like to say, Udi, Hanyang, Udioi, Pisang, Shi Dacha Kim, Mankom Sei, Beschang Dacha. As I mentioned earlier, an autococker is a very mechanical gun, composed of a lot of small subsystems interacting with each other. So to have a chance at timing, you're going to have to know what those subsystems are and their basic functions. So we'll start with your inline regulator. Your inline regulator is taking your tank pressure and dropping it down probably to around 300 psi. We'll talk about that later. Next is your three-way. Your three-way can be thought of essentially as a switch. It switches the direction of the air that is going to the ram. So this is a typical three-way. It's an aluminum body, perhaps black anodized, perhaps chrome. If it's really old, it might be brass. You have 3 hose barbs sticking off of it. Internal to the body, you'll have a small shaft, usually brass or steel, with a couple O-rings on it. Again, if it's really old, it might have 3 O-rings on it. There's a few different designs on the market for this. To make it easier to visualize this, we have a model here. At a resting position, your air is entering from the LPR through the middle barb, filling up this section of the three-way. The air then routes to the front of the three-way and up and out of this hose barb. And at a resting position, this hose barb is going to be sending air to the back of your ram to hold the back block forward. When you pull the trigger, the three-way shaft moves backwards. Now, this air chamber is cut off, and instead the air is rerouted to go through the back of the three-way. That air now exits and goes to the front of the ram to cock the gun backwards. Now, something you should note, if you are using a hinge frame due to the motion of the trigger plate, this is actually backwards. At a resting position, you'll be back like this. When you pull the trigger, it actually moves forward. All that really means is that you need to change the hoses and which part of the ram they go to if you're using a hinge frame. Next, we have the LPR. The LPR's job is to take the approximately 300 psi coming from your regulator and dropping it down closer to about 70 to 100 psi, which is what the gun actually needs to cycle the block back and forth. Next, you have the ram. The ram has about 1.5 inches of stroke length, meaning how far it will travel each time the trigger is pulled. Its job is to cock the back block, recock the hammer to get ready to fire the next shot. Then we have the side pump rod, which joins the ram to the back block. It is the least sexy of autococker parts. It's basically the Steve Buscemi of autococker parts. Next, we have the back block. The back block's job is to hold the bolt as it moves back and forth and to grab the cocking rod and cock it. For the purpose of this discussion, we're going to utterly ignore the existence of other block styles like turtle blocks, P blocks, reverse blocks. If you have a problem with that, you can go to the comments and complain. We will assign an AG staff member to ignore it. Next, we have the cocking rod screwed into the hammer internally. Its job is to be grabbed by the back block, pulling the hammer back until it's recocked. Next, hidden inside the gun, you have the internal velocity adjuster, also known as the IVG. This you would access by unscrewing your cocking rod, using a 3/16 hex wrench, screwing it in to increase velocity, backing it out to reduce velocity. There are different forms of this. This is not the only style that you're going to find. Matter of fact, this is an older style. Next, you have the hammer and the sear lug. The hammer's job is to simply be a large mass of metal that flies forward and strikes the valve, thereby opening up the valve and allowing air to escape. You also have the sear lug. Sear lug is what catches on the sear plate and lets the gun be ready for the next time you pull the trigger. Next, also hidden inside the gun, would be your valve. Your valve consists of a valve body, a small steel rod, and a cup seal, and a spring. This is where the air waits for the gun to be fired. When the gun is fired, your hammer strikes the tip of this and opens up the valve just long enough to allow some air to escape. Next, you have the trigger frame and its internal components. And its internal components consist of a trigger plate, a trigger spring, a sear spring, and a sear plate. When the trigger is pulled, the nose of the sear plate rides up this ramp and allows the back end of the sear plate, which catches on the hammer, to pivot and drop down. Finally, we have a hinge frame, and the internals to that are slightly different. The trigger plate is removed, and instead it's replaced by a hinge trigger, which rotates, and this piece rotates up and interacts with the nose of that sear plate instead. Okay, now let's talk about sequence of operations. To time an autococker, you really have to learn to think about an autococker as a sequence of actions. So, what is a sequence of actions? As you begin to pull the trigger, the first thing that should happen, if it's properly timed, is the hammer should fire. And the hammer is located about here, but you can observe the hammer firing by watching the cocking rod moving. So, you start pulling the trigger, hammer fires, it strikes the valve opens up, allows air to be released. The air goes up from the lower chamber into the bolt redirects that air, sending it down the barrel, shooting the ball out. A little bit further in the trigger stroke, you should be activating the three-way, if properly timed. Three-way is found on the right side of the gun. The three-way, as I mentioned earlier, should be thought of as an air switch. Now that the three-way has been activated by your trigger pull, the air is rerouted to the front of the ram. The air reaches the front of the ram, it pushes on a seal, and it forces the gun to cycle backwards. So the side pump rod pushes back on the back block. Two things happen when the back block moves backwards. One is it recocks the hammer. The inside here, the sear lug catches on that sear plate. And number two, the bolt moves back far enough to allow another paintball to drop into the breech. As you release the trigger, the three-way reverses course, sends air to the back of the ram, which now pulls the back block forward, sliding the paintball into the breech, clearing the back block away from the cocking rod, and your gun is now ready to shoot again. So, Matt, surely we're ready to start timing the autococker now, right? Can I take my wrenches and get to work? No, sorry, we're not done yet. First thing we need to do is set it up correctly, right? If we don't have some basic stuff set up correctly, no amount of adjusting and tweaking stuff is going to make the gun work. So we have to get a few things right. So let's assume that the person that owned you before this just completely butchered it. The first thing that we're going to start with is the cocking rod. The cocking rod is a big fat knob screwed onto this shaft. Please no giggling. And you need to set the depth of this onto the threaded portion of this correctly, or else your bolt will not clear the chamber. So depending on the location of this cocking knob, it will or will not allow the bolt tip to clear the chamber, which is what you need for a paintball to drop correctly. If this portion is threaded on too far, then the bolt tip will not completely clear the chamber, and it's going to be difficult for paintball to drop in. If this is too far back off of the rod, well, then the stroke length of the ram will not be enough to fully pull it back and catch the hammer on the sear lug. So first thing we need to do is set that correctly. Most people will take a little bit of blue Loctite once they've got it to the right position and lock it into place. So you're going to adjust the depth of this onto the cocking rod. Each time you make an adjustment, cock the gun manually and then take a look inside of the breech, see if the bolt tip is just about clearing the back edge of the breech. Next thing, let's talk about your HPR, your high pressure regulator. This needs to be set correctly to get any kind of velocity. A common reason that autocockers are brought to us for repair is because this is just too far out of adjustment. Now, around this time, I'll put up a graph so that you can look at it now. Okay, So I made up some of those numbers, but the basic idea is that as you increase the output pressure of your regulator, your velocity will start climbing. Beyond a certain point, your velocity will actually start declining. The extra pressure is helping to hold that valve closed. So what pressure is correct? Well, that's determined by the valve that's inside of your gun. So if you have a stock bone factory valve, then it's probably around 300 to 325 is a pretty typical adjustment point. If you have something fancier like a rat valve from Shock Tech or God knows what else, you want to check with that manufacturer and find out what their pressures they recommend you set it to. Further complicating matters is the spring inside the valve. If it's the stock spring, the manufacturer put it in there, then just go with what the valve manufacturer recommends. If somebody has used a spring kit to change the spring tension on either the hammer or especially the valve, what the factory recommendation for pressure may not be correct. So a further complication. In any case, to adjust this correctly, you're probably going to need some kind of reg tester. Very few front blocks on the market have a gauge built into it to let you adjust and watch the output pressure. So if you make friends with your local paintball gun tech, they might have rigged up something that looks like this that you can screw a regulator into and then watch the output pressure. Other than that, I don't know how you're going to know the output pressure of this, right? So you're going to have some kind of reg tester. You could build your own or find somebody that already has one. So set this correctly for starters. Get that going. All right. Another really common mistake I see when people are setting up autocockers to get running for the first time is actually how far their back block is threaded onto their side pump rod, right? If it's not threaded on far enough and you push it to a closed position, you'll see a gap. And that gap will tell you that you haven't threaded it on far enough. So you back it off a little bit to clear some room, maybe spin it a couple times, see how it fits. There's still a little gap there. I don't love that gap, so I'm going to back it off, screw it in just a little bit more, and then put it there, okay? I do not recommend, and this is controversial, you'll have people screaming in the comments at me, I do not recommend Loctiting your back block on your side pump rod. There's no reason for that. When the gun is in motion, there's no way for the side pump rod to come unscrewed from the back block and out of place. And that's because it has a small angle on it, and it's locked into a channel, and it cannot free spin. If you want to, I would put a little bit of blue Loctite onto the ram where it connects to the side pump rod, but not the back block. Please don't. Okay, so if you screw this on too far, then you are slamming the back block into the body harder than necessary, and you're taking away a little bit of the stroke length, which is usually about 1.25 inches from the ram. So that's what you want to do to set it up correctly. Okay, next issue I want to talk about is setting the internal velocity adjuster to a good starting position before you start timing your autococker. If you screw this with your 3/16 Allen wrench in too far, you'll get so much spring tension going on here when the hammer tries to cock that it may actually prevent the gun from functioning. Back it out too far and nothing horrible happens, but you're going to have to rely more on your regulator to provide for the fact there's not enough spring tension. My recommendation when setting it up for the first time is probably setting your internal velocity adjuster to about halfway through its threaded portion. And then that will give you future room to increase the tension or decrease the tension depending on your velocity. I really recommend that you don't use your regulator, your inline high pressure regulator, as your source of velocity adjustment. It's easy, it's quick, it's a little bit lazy way to do it. This is a better way to do it, even though it's kind of a pain in the butt to get at for your day-to-day velocity adjustment at the chronograph, right? But to set the gun up, I put it about halfway, and then I start timing the gun. For this purpose, I've taken the back block and the bolt and stuff out of the way just to make it easier to look at. Okay, the last setup issue that you want to have ready before you start timing your autococker is the sear lug depth, right? So the sear lug sticks out of the hammer, it catches on the sear plate, and how far it is sticking out determines at what point in the trigger pull does this release. Now, when we're setting up the gun, if we have this sticking out too far, it could get to the point where it won't even release at all. You can pull the trigger and the sear plate can't clear the edge of this and fire off. If you have it up too high, then it won't even catch on the sear plate. Kind of a worst case scenario is when you have it just enough that while testing it, it feels like it's catching, but then at a full firing cycle, it just keeps missing the sear lug and the gun's struggling to function. So you adjust that through the top of the gun using a 1/8 hex wrench, right? And your autococker will have a hole drilled in the top of the body, right there. And to access your hammer, generally speaking, you're going to remove the bolt. You're going to do this with a gun depressurized. It's usually easier. And drop your hex wrench inside of there. You usually have to grab the cocking rod and move it around a little bit till you feel that seat into the sear lug. Right? So now we can adjust the depth of the sear lug right through the top of the body. The traditional old school way to do this is that you back it up until it's no longer catching on the sear plate, and you're pulling the cocking rod and it just doesn't catch. You start screwing it downward and start just doing a pull test. And you pull it hard to the back, release it, and see if it's catching on the sear plate. This is just a setup, right? This is just to get the gun ready to start timing. You're going to go back and adjust that sear lug depth later on when we do timing. But that's usually enough just to get the gun ready to go ahead and time. Okay, so we've done all that. Are we ready to time the autococker? Yeah, believe it or not, we are. We're probably at like, what, the 25-minute mark of this video or something? And I'm not apologizing. That's how long this stuff takes, right? You chose to buy an autococker. This is on you. It's not my fault. So what tools do I need to time my autococker? Well, not a lot, really. I'm going to get if I can, a T-handled hex wrench to make it easier to get in there and adjust the sear lug depth. I'm going to, believe it or not, have a set of needle nose pliers, and this is going to help me adjust the three-way timing. Right? Then I'm going to have my set of folding hex wrenches. No, I won't, because these are garbage, and you shouldn't own these. These are awful. Right? If you own those, you're a garbage person. What you should have is a set like this, right? And even better if you have a set with little ball ends on the bottom. It makes it much easier to get in at angles. Make sure that you never ever loan these to your friends. They will never come back. As a matter of fact, I have a set of these in my gear bag to loan to idiots that didn't bring their own tools, and they deserve it. Okay, yay, now we're timing. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check my LPR pressure, right? Your LPR on most autocockers is adjustable. You can adjust how much pressure is coming out of the LPR, which is going to the ram. If this is too low, the gun is not going to cycle, and you're going to waste a bunch of time making adjustments trying to figure out why the gun's not working when you just don't have enough pressure to cycle the gun correctly. So, I'm going to check this by actually backing it out. Be careful, there are some, usually European, of course, that backing it out actually raises the pressure. But on most LPRs, backing off the adjustment knob lowers the pressure. So I'm going to back that off. I'm going to pull the trigger a little bit, and I've backed it off enough the gun won't even fire anymore. Now I'm going to start screwing it in while I pull the trigger. I start getting enough pressure for the back block to start cycling. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And now I've got enough pressure to fully cycle the gun, recock the hammer, and get ready for the next shot. I don't think that that's enough to go play with. I'm going to go another maybe quarter, half turn or something like that, but I'm not going to sit here cranking it down, right? I don't want maximum pressure leaving this LPR. Next thing I'm going to do is check that sequence of timing, right? So what I'd like to see when I pull the trigger is the hammer fires first and then the back block cycles. I'm going to slow it down, and that is what I'd like to hear, right? Hammer fires first, and then the back block cycles. But let's pretend that's not happening. How do we adjust that timing? Okay, so how do we actually adjust this three-way timing through this coupler? So the first thing we need to do is, there's usually a set screw right here locking the actuator coupler into place, right? Because you don't want it spinning on you during the course of fire. So you remove this set screw. This set screw is ungodly easy to lose. I and most autococker techs have spent hours and hours of our lives on the floor looking around for this stupid set screw that has leapt off the table and has gone just who the hell knows where it's gone. So anyways, don't lose this. It's really super easy to lose. Remove that screw, set it to the side. That's the point where, at least in my case, I find it easiest to use a pair of very fine needle nose pliers to grab that coupler and turn it. Now be careful. If you jam these in here and just start ripping them around, you can really scratch up your front block. So you want to be a little bit careful with that. But anyways, you can just spin this actuating coupler, checking the timing each time, and then put in the set screw again when you're done, when you're satisfied you're in the right place. So it's that easy, right? You just adjust the actuating coupler, or you adjust the sear lug depth, bada bing, bada boom, you're done, all good, right? Well, no. You're going to make a lot of adjustments. And really what we're going to get into at this point is philosophy of trigger pull. I know that sounds quite crazy, but each gun tech, each personal autococker owner has a slightly different philosophy on that sequence of events and how close they should occur to each other. Now, a common philosophy is, man, I want to make the trigger pull as short as possible, right? Well, yeah, but you can start getting into reliability issues if you don't do it right. So if you don't have that sear lug deep enough, you start having problems with it skipping off the sear plate. If you don't have the actuating rod set at a reasonable distance, then maybe you don't have enough trigger pull to even fully actuate the throughway. All right, so my philosophy, and feel free to skip forward in this video and listen to your friend that has his own philosophy. I don't really know, and I don't really care. My philosophy is I don't go too crazy on that, right? I want to have a reliable moment where the sear lug drops. So that's not going to be, I'm not going to try to time it crazy to near the first time I barely touch the trigger will the hammer drop in the gunfire. I don't find that reliable. And then same thing, I'm going to give a little bit of timing gap between when that hammer fires and when the three-way actuates and the back block cycles, right? I'm a little bit more conservative on that. I don't want those two things occurring, those two events in the timeline occurring too close to each other. Why is that? Well, the reason is for the gun to work properly. If the hammer fires too close to that moment in time when the three-way activates and pulls the back block, then what happens is that your hammer barely has a chance to strike the valve before your back block is already in motion, grabbing that hammer and pulling it away from the valve. This is what I think is a pretty common mistake in time in autocockers. Now, don't get me wrong, the autococker will still probably function. You may not even know that it's not working great. But the reason I don't like it is because you're putting more stress on the system where the back block is catching the hammer while it's still flying forward, right? So the hammer and the cocking rod are really slamming into that back block. And as a result, the hammer is barely making contact with that valve and barely getting the valve to open before the whole thing is being yanked backwards by the cocking block. So again, in that timeline of events, I would like the hammer to make a nice full strike on the valve, opening the valve up and allowing air to release before that cocking block activates and pulls the whole thing back, right? So that's a pretty common mistake. Okay, let's say you ignore my advice and you want to make the trigger pull shorter. Fine, I give up. You're going to do whatever you want. However, you need to make sure that your gun will even allow there to be any point to that. What do I mean by that? Well, not every trigger frame has set screws that can allow you to limit the full backwards travel, right? So let's say you time the gun so that it fires really early and it activates the back block really early, but you can't do anything about the over travel, and you're still going to be pulling the trigger the full length that the slide frame or hinge frames allow. Well, then what was the point, right? You made the gun work worse. You really haven't gotten much out of it, in my opinion. So if you're determined to try to make the gun fire very aggressively early on in the trigger pull and cycle really early on in the sequence of events, you might want to just double check that your frame can even limit that rearward travel, right? And that's usually done by set screws inside of the frame. There's no easy way to locate it outside. You kind of have to take the frame off and look inside there and see if the manufacturer of your particular frame has put a set screw, and it's usually horizontal, and it's usually sitting right about here, that can limit the backwards travel of the trigger plate. So double check that. Now, hinge frames almost always have that. Hinge frames only came about in, boy, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s. I really don't know when these came out. But hinge frames, I have not seen one of these that does not have a system for limiting the rearward travel, right? So you're pretty certain you're going to be able to do that if that's the way you want to go. Now, if an autococker is timed over conservatively, meaning that time gap between when the hammer fires and when the back block activates, there's a huge time gap. Well, actually the gun's still going to function, right? It still will do its vent. It'll do it very efficiently. The valve will get a nice full opening before the hammer retracts, but it doesn't sound right. And if you have an autococker that has that huge time gap, other people will notice and say, oh, your gun doesn't sound right. Now, ironically, it's actually working perfectly fine, but it makes almost a burping noise, right? And other autococker owners will notice it and chastise you and make you feel bad. Now, there is a negative to that. If you're overly conservative with the timing of the trigger pull, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for a very late activation of the back block, activation of the three-way, and hence the back block. If you make that too late in the trigger pull, then what you're risking is more likely you're going to short stroke the gun, meaning you don't make a complete pull or a complete release. When you don't make a complete pull or a complete release, then your air switch, your three-way, gets confused about how it's sending air to the ram. The gun struggles to cycle. You may not catch the hammer on the sear lug. You have all sorts of problems. So there is some value to not going too conservative on the timing and risking short stroking. Now, you can short stroke a autococker trigger at any time. That usually happens under the stress of a game. You're flustered, people are shooting at you, people are screaming at you, your teammates are being pulled off the field for penalties, at least my teammates do, and you short stroke the trigger. It can happen, right? So that can happen in any case, but if you time it too conservatively, you increase the odds of that. If you time it too aggressively, like we talked about earlier, you can have your own problems with the sear lugger skipping off the hammer. Anyways, I've been rambling for a while. So what am I trying to tell you? That's what I meant by it's a philosophy, right? If you line up 20 different autococker techs and tell them to time 20 different autocockers, they're probably all going to come out slightly different, right? And there's some tips and tricks about how to make it more reliable if you want to shorten the trigger pull and whatnot. I'll probably do a follow-up video of this because God knows you haven't heard me talking enough yet. But in any case, that's timing in a nutshell. Okay, well, that's what I got for you. Hopefully, if you're a first-time owner, you've learned a bit about how to make one of these things run. They're a fairly complex mechanical machine, as paintball guns go. Matter of fact, as paintball guns go, it probably has the most complexity of any mechanical gun that's been on the market, right? I suspect a lot of people that are watching this video are actually longtime owners and probably already know a lot of what I just said. Not a lot of people have owned an autococker for this long that haven't learned a thing or two about timing, and autococker owners tend to be longtime players. They tend to be old people. Nonetheless, hopefully I've given you a few tips or tricks. I'm sure if you share this video with another autococker tech or longtime autococker owner, they'll have a difference in opinion on some of the things I taught you how to do, especially the philosophy of timing. That's fine, whatever. You know, I don't know everything. I've been doing this a while, but I don't know everything. And I'm a generalist when it comes to fixing paintball guns. I'm not a specialist. So I'm sure there's more knowledge out there than I just gave you. But in any case, learn how to time it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us at AG Paintball. Matter of fact, tech@agpaintball.com. We are happy to answer any question that we can help answer. We love this sport and we love helping players. So give us a shout out. Keep using your autocockers. Keep the flame alive. And see you out there on the field. Thank you. And ending credits, and bonus scene. The bonus scene is E-blades. This is going to be quick, right? So if you have an E-blade, real quick, cock the gun and push up on this tiny little plunger that's attached to the solenoid. You should hear the hammer fire, right? If you've done it correctly. Should fire about halfway through that tiny little stroke on the solenoid plunger, right? The other important part of timing, change your battery, and you're done. E-blades are really easy to take care of, right? There's not a lot of timing. So good luck. Thank you.